fond memories of playing real-time strategy games? Do you get a little spike of adrenaline when you hear that your favorite devs of your favorite series are working on something new and exciting? Do you sit at your window like a love-struck puppy waiting for the news to arrive that an RTS is finally worth playing again? Well, don't, because RTS is dead.
You can't kill the Messiah.
Often in the recent past, when I've spoken to people about RTS games, I've always been given this impression from the response that RTS is a dead genre, something that needs to be revived or brought back to the good old days. I've heard this same sentiment espoused so often that it's honestly really hard not to mention it, despite how cliche it has become in so many of these YouTube video essays regarding RTS. It's something I've heard fairly consistently, at least since the early 2010s, honestly, with the, at the time, kind of questionable release of StarCraft 2, as well as the grand failure of Command & Conquer 4. Back then, the question was focused around consoles. PC was kind of seen as like a dead end, while the console market was just booming and seeing massive growth. RTS was seen as just too intricate for consoles, and thus, frankly, an outdated game model. Later in kind of the late 2010s, the same questions instead focused around the mobile market and the rise of MOBAs into popularity, as well as the younger generation apparently not enjoying complex games. So is this true? I've definitely seen many dozens of videos and articles and long-winded online posts making this exact statement at least. For my own part, I also fell into a period around the early 2010s, I guess, where I basically kind of stopped playing RTS games through a combination of changing tastes as well as many older games slowly dying or seeing their online servers go offline. However, before that, I would argue that RTS games were what I played most often, as I was never really much of a console gamer, and these were the kind of definitive PC multiplayer games that weren't FPS, basically. Warcraft, StarCraft, Age of Empires, Total Annihilation, Command & Conquer, Red Alert, and many others I enjoyed and played through the campaign several times. As for multiplayer, the Age of, Red Alert, and Blizzard RTS games were usually what I played the most, especially a lot of their custom games, and generally more kind of casual maps rather than the more competitive ladder play. I was even a big fan of Dota for Warcraft 3, though I never really got into later MOBAs. Despite this, however, I did enjoy the competitive scene, even watching some Korean esports and playing StarCraft Brood War on ladder. Now, it's undeniable that the RTS genre has seen a decline in prestige since the early 2000s, being superseded on PC by other genres, and of course in the wider gaming space as a whole. But why did this really happen? I think there are a lot of reasons which have been detailed many times before, and personally I see it as being very similar to the decline of classic CRPGs around kind of the similar time frame. There are a lot of reasons behind this, and aside from a few cases where there was a very severe mishandling of the franchise, again, Command & Conquer 4 comes to mind, I don't see this as particularly the fault of any one company or the result of any singular issue. In my opinion, the biggest reasons for the decline in big budget RTS games were the general shift by publishers and consumers away from the PC market in the late 2000s and early 2010s, as well as just genre dissolution, as many formerly RTS gamers spread out to related yet still separate genres such as MOBAs, grand strategy, and more simulation-focused games, among others. A lot of other issues largely stem from these two, and frankly, I don't really see much point in going too much further into detail about them at the moment, as really there are many others who have done it before. Rather, what I'd prefer to discuss first is what actually made these older RTS games good to begin with, and how they actually acquired their audience, as well as discussing why I think many current RTS fans can be a bit misguided in diagnosing the decline of RTS. Following that, I will take a look at some more modern RTS and what the space is kind of evolving into currently. When talking about good classic RTS games, I'll specifically look at a few fan favorites, mainly StarCraft, Warcraft, Warcraft 3, Command & Conquer 2, Age of Empires 2. While these games are all quite different and often appeal to very different players, there are a few key features they all shared which I think supported their success and long-term enduring popularity. The first thing was their very clear theming and designs for units and game assets overall. These strong themes also extended to the faction designs as well, with every game listed having very distinct and memorable factions that often played quite differently and had their own unique personality, down even to individual units being very memorable. Age of Empires was probably the most muted of these, as it was by far the most realistic design-wise thanks to its setting, but they really nailed the art direction in making the units easily readable, while also having a bit of personality to them, which added to the appeal of the game. Even the multitude of nations in Age of Empires 2 still felt fairly distinct enough that you could grow attached to them, even if for the most part their generic unit roster was basically the same as any other nation. This clarity of theme, combined with the fairly generic settings, made it easy for players to grow attached to specific factions or even specific units or characters, and introduce an aspect of role-playing to the games. RTS games have always had this role-playing aspect to them, even going back to something like Dune 2, simply due to the focus being on individual units or a specific faction, rather than more generic army groups as in traditional strategy war games. A good RTS can really nail the feeling you get if you ever play tabletop wargaming, except with the added benefit of a more cinematic experience that real-time combat brings. Speaking of the cinematic experience, the graphics and art direction are always a major factor in success of these games. I really can't imagine StarCraft becoming the titan of the genre it did if not for the explosions of gore or all the little animated doodads peppered throughout the maps and buildings. Warcraft 3, of course, took the cinematic nature of RTS to a new level by integrating an incredibly fleshed out story, close to what you'd see in many RPGs into the game. Something like Homeworld as well did something a little bit similar, but instead of focusing on individual characters, it really tried to flesh out your faction and you as the commander as a character rather than individual characters within the story. This crossover with RPG should not really be understated, as by far the most popular genre for RTS fans, besides RTS, are RPGs. It makes the connection even deeper when you consider how thin the dividing line between something like a real-time combat RPG and an RTS really is, with things like Dota being almost a marriage between the two genres. The last big benefit to the enduring popularity of these games was the community aspect, custom games and maps. This, alongside the campaigns, is what I most often hear brought up as a reason why new RTS games fail. And while I agree that these things made older games much better, like definitely something like Warcraft 3 or StarCraft would not be as beloved or as iconic today without that big community support behind it. I still disagree with the idea that this is what newer games should focus on if they want to succeed. Communities are built naturally around games they enjoy. They can't really be brute force just by adding mod tools and a big campaign. Lastly, I think when it comes to multiplayer in all these games, while I don't agree that competitive players are the problem, as they are really only a benefit to any game, I do think that these games not being hyper optimized for esports, but rather leaving some breathing room for casuals did broaden their multiplayer appeal and thus their staying power. Multiplayer then, as now of course, is what gets most people invested and arguably is the second most important aspect after just core game mechanics. StarCraft 2 developers notably worked really hard to achieve this sort of balance between making the game fun for casuals as well as the sweats in multiplayer. And I think they did a really good job, honestly. At the very least, in any decent RTS, this should allow for some degree of self-segregation between more casual players and the more hardcore ones. With all that being said, how does this relate to the RTS space today? While I think a lot of these things I mentioned still carry weight today, there are two major lodestones around the necks of contemporary RTS devs. The weight of nostalgia combined with budgetary restrictions. We simply don't have the AAA big budget studios putting out RTS games anymore. So a lot of the stuff players might expect from games like StarCraft 2 simply just can't happen coming from an indie dev team, at least not on a tight time schedule. As for nostalgia, I feel like it has grossly warped player expectations, as well as impressions of any modern game. For example, whenever I try to introduce people to some new RTS, a common complaint is that, oh, it's not like whatever old game. RTS games really need to be more than just rehashes of old games, but the weight of these nostalgic expectations makes it really difficult. It's no wonder that by far the most popular new RTS games today are almost all remakes or remasters. Now, despite these two glaring issues, I do think that there are a lot of our recent RTS games that are not only fun to play right now, but offer a lot of future potential for development as well. Two I'd specifically like to talk about, mostly because I've actually played them quite a bit, are Beyond All Reason and Tempest Rising. Both of these games are pretty strongly influenced by older classics, namely Total Annihilation and Command & Conquer. As I said, I do think some degree of nostalgia bait is sadly unavoidable, but both these games don't lean into it too deeply, so I wasn't really that bothered or felt myself wishing I was just playing some of the older games instead. Starting with Tempest Rising, it's the newest of the two, releasing around the spring of 2025, and the most standard in terms of design. It very openly borrows themes from Command & Conquer games, and almost feels like basically a good version of Command & Conquer 4, or rather what I guess it could have been if it just evolved from Command & Conquer 3 rather than being just a total mess of mobile slop. Tempest was released by an indie studio which also made a few other games I quite like, such as Iron Fury, so I was looking forward to this release when I heard about it. The main developer is also a huge RTS nerd and actually runs a blog where he analyzes basically every RTS in existence. Tempest Rising is set in an alternate timeline where there was a nuclear war in the 1960s between the Western and Eastern blocks, leaving Eurasia especially devastated by fallout in the aftermath. The West took the global homo pill as in real life, but also remembered not to totally deindustrialize, so they still have a formidable military, giving the in-game GDF a sort of NATO wave vibe to it. Much less gritty than the GDI in Command & Conquer 3, but rather more feeling like a sort of sleek American authoritarian police state. They really lean into this as well with a lot of the riot control themed units, which I really do like just for the flavor, showing that the GDF is not some freedom-loving, democracy gung-ho liberals, but rather more like the liberals you see when you start making a fuss about things like workers' rights or say something too naughty on Twitter. Tempest Dynasty is the vaguely Eastern faction that seems to be a mix of Eastern European, Soviet bloc, Chinese communists, and ultra-nationalists, and all around kind of giga-chuddery. They're the BRICS Uber Alles faction if BRICS wasn't a huge meme, basically. Most of their equipment revolves around a heavy industrial theme, combined with huge explosives and some kind of psychic fuckery. They're kind of a mix between Nod from Command & Conquer and the Soviets from Red Alert thematically. Despite the sort of derivative theming, I really do like how the factions play out in the game. They're very different from older Command & Conquer factions, offering a lot of player flexibility and alternate playstyles. Many individual units have special abilities which can work together with other units in a larger army, or even go alone in small tactical groups. It's entirely possible in this game to run a small tactical strike team who can sneak around the enemy position to sabotage them while your main forces deal with theirs. Now, this is nothing really new to RTS, of course. Raiding is a huge part of really any game, but I do enjoy that the unique unit abilities and synergies make this kind of more interesting tactically, as well as thematically. This game made a big deal about having a full set of faction campaigns, which while I appreciate, I do wish they put a bit more focus on the multiplayer aspect. The lack of game types means you're either stuck in a 1v1 or 2v2 deathmatch only, and for me, I find sometimes I have to wait quite a while to even find a match at all. Lack of map-making tools means custom games are often just dead. I do understand the rationale for this, however. A lot of players will initially buy a game for a fun campaign, and then other features can be expanded upon later. StarCraft 2 notably had a lot of things lacking on initial release, but has since grown into a really deep and varied experience. I personally enjoyed the campaign. I played the GDF and a little bit of Tempest, and I'm looking forward to see how the future updates expand on the game, such as adding more factions, which the devs say is coming soon. One thing I'd personally love to see are some sub-factions, a little bit similar to what you saw in Command & Conquer Generals, to make multiplayer a bit more varied and open up free-for-all as a game mode, since, in my opinion, it's the best game mode. Overall, the best thing about this game, and the biggest reason why I liked it, was how tight the unit controls are. Even something as simple as being able to move a single unit through a group of your other units without the whole formation breaking apart or without them having to take some ridiculous roundabout route around them. That alone really sold me on the unit control. Everything just works very smoothly. Pathing is excellent and units respond really quickly and accurately to commands. My only nag, I guess I would say, is how annoying it can be to split armies. If I want to break off my drone pilots, for example, it's really a hassle to do so quickly and easily compared to games like, for example, StarCraft, where separating off a group of units or just splitting the army is really trivial. The second game I want to talk about is Beyond All Reason, or BAR, or I guess BAR. I don't really know how the acronym is said. This game takes inspiration from Total Annihilation and is an open source project which I've been following for some time. Now, this is the game I've been the most excited about and recently has got me back into playing RTS again pretty regularly. It basically goes against everything the average classic RTS fan claims RTS games need today to be successful. It has no campaign. It only recently got some basic scenarios. It's pretty competitive. It's not really terribly easy for a total casual player to just pick up and play, and involves a ton of micro and macro gameplay. Yet it all just kind of works and makes for a really entertaining and interesting experience in my opinion. The big gimmick behind BAR is the absolutely gigantic battles it can support, as well as having massive games involving many dozens of players. I've seen games online of over 100 players, and the average game size, it seems, is about 16 players when I check for custom games open. Being open source, it also has a pretty decent and dedicated community, which can be good or bad depending on your feelings toward it. For me, who plays a lot of niche games, I really enjoy having a decent player base online at all times, and never really having issues filling up a lobby, even a pretty large one. Even despite these gigantic games, I find at least on my machine, BAR runs very well, and I never really have issues with things like slowdown or missed clicks. Another feature which I enjoy is the terrain, as it plays a big role in combat, favoring different kind of unit composition or even allowing for terrain deformation, which you can use to kind of change those set advantages. It is a really complex game and obviously has a very high skill ceiling, which honestly I don't really see as a bad thing, despite what many others say. I'm absolutely not a pro level player myself in any RTS game, let alone BAR, but I really never have issues finding games where I could fit in skill wise. In general, I've never really understood the arguments that games requiring skill or being competitive was a bad thing, unless you are just like some total soy boy who hates the idea of having to put any effort in at all to do anything. For me, losing a match is not really a huge deal when the matches are often not really longer than 30 minutes, and it's not that difficult to find a game that is really more at your skill level, or else get auto match with someone who is. To me, games offering the chance for skill expression and personal growth only benefits the experience and motivates players. Meanwhile, every single game which tries to punish competition or so-called toxic behavior inevitably becomes just a pointless or boring experience. The core issue is not punishing competitive players, but leaving some room for casual, some breathing room, as I mentioned before, to at least have their own fun and not feel completely out of the loop or unable to even get their foot in the door when it comes to enjoying the game. In this respect, BAR does a good job at new player onboarding, and if you're a cooperative player, they're often huge team games where you can still contribute as one person on a team of 50 or so. BAR is still in active development, of course, so many of these things might change in the future. For example, a full set of campaigns is planned, among other things, and I, for one, am really looking forward to its future growth. Beyond these two games, there are a ton of RTSs out there which are active or being released soon, albeit again, a lot of the popular ones are remasters. I do appreciate that a lot of these remasters at least have been handled quite well, and even have expanded upon what was originally there. Age of Empires 2 Definitive Edition being by far the best and most perfect example of this. If anything, instead of being dead, I think RTS is really doing better now than it has done for the past maybe 10 or 15 years. With the PC market larger than ever and console players finally entering the dustbin of history where they belong, I think the comeback of a lot of classic PC genres is really more than assured. You can even see this with the relatively recent rise, or I guess rebirth, of CRPGs, with something like Baldur's Gate 3 being one of the biggest recent games of all time. Meanwhile, I remember 10 years ago, these were by far incredibly tiny niche games that no one gave a shit about except some grognards on PC. What really made RTS so successful in the past, in my opinion, was really how easy they were to get into and improve compared to the more detail-heavy and granular turn-based war games of the past. The more evocative and personal style of RTS make combat more action-packed and cinematic, yet still allowing for the feeling of commanding large battles. And the focus on individual units over entire squads or army groups allows for greater roleplay and storytelling potential. RTS is just at a much lower level of abstraction compared to more grand scale strategy games, and I think that has always been the key to its popularity. For me personally, I've been drifting away from these sort of grand strategy type games for years now, as I just kind of get exhausted by the multitude of details, and lately tend to prefer more punchy and faster paced experiences. This also comes back to my argument that story and cool themes are really less important than the core gameplay being just smooth and reactive. What I like most about many classic games and about Tempest Rising and BAR is how great they feel to play. How everything just works together to create that dynamic and atmospheric battlefield experience. All of this just something you can never really get in the more abstract strategy games. RTS, in my opinion, is not dead. Far from it. In fact, it's incredibly easy to find matches online or even new games to try. And always the number one thing that keeps RTS players coming back or entices new ones is that community aspect. Few games really have the same sort of fast-paced yet strategic multiplayer gameplay that RTS does, and that's not going to change anytime soon. The best thing I can say for anyone who wants to get into RTS games is really just to chill out and just play. If you're not the kind of person who has like a panic attack when put under any sort of pressure, I don't really see that significant of a barrier to entry for anyone to start playing. For myself, after barely playing RTS games for like a decade, I feel I really didn't have a big issue getting back into online play. And honestly, I don't think many other people would either. And remember guys, if you like the kind of content I make here, remember to like the video and subscribe to my channel. It really helps me out a lot. But either way guys, I'll see you again next time. So goodbye everyone.